But the olive tree said to them, Shall I leave my fatness, with which God and men are honored, and go to wave over the trees? Then the trees said to the fig tree, You come, reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, Shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit, and go to wave over the trees? Then the tree said to the vine, You come, reign over us. But the vine said to them, Shall I leave my new wine, which cheers God and men, and go to wave over the trees? Finally, all the trees said to the bramble, You come, reign over us. The bramble said to the trees, If in truth you are anointing me as king over you, come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, may fire come out from the bramble and consume the cedars of Lebanon.
Good morning, everybody. If you want to go ahead and be opening your Bible back to the same passage that was just read, Judges 9, we'll spend most of our time there this morning. Good to be with you this morning. I guess it's become something of a tradition when Chris is out of the country to ask me to come fill in for him. I did notice that I am the last one, so I don't know if that means anything or not. I do typically, when I'm up here, make a joke at his expense. Usually it's something about the clock or what time you might get to lunch today. Since he's here, I'm not going to make any jokes about that today. So what I want to talk about this morning, I was asked to put this together for class at Hillview here recently. We this quarter been doing a series on Wednesday nights with different guys in the congregation speaking each time. And the topic was just some hidden treasures in Scripture and looking at maybe some stories that we don't often think about. So I can almost guarantee you probably have not heard a sermon about this person we're going to talk about tonight, this morning. In Judges chapter 9, we'll start there in just a minute. How many of you know the Judges song? I know Wells does. He's been singing it all week. If you think about the song, help you remember all the names of the judges. There's one name in there that you might argue doesn't really fit, and that is Abimelech. Abimelech is the son of Jerubbaal, or the son of Gideon. We usually call him Gideon. And as we're going to look this morning, I don't think he really fits the criteria of a judge. So maybe we should nix him from that song. So good to remember, of course. But let's look beginning here in. We're going to back up into Judges chapter 8 a little bit and get some background here on the end of Gideon's life. So if you remember Gideon, of course, an angel comes to him and tells him he's going to lead the people to defeat Midian. And after quite a bit of reluctance, he does that, and you remember the miraculous way in which that's accomplished. After all that's over with, we get just a brief synopsis of the rest of Gideon's life. So we'll start looking at verse 22. So the men of Israel said to Gideon, Rule over us, both you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. If you remember, maybe a couple hundred years before this, God had specifically told the people that they would not have a king, right? He said, I will be your king. You're not going to have a king. But the people are happy enough with Gideon and his leadership that they ask him to become their king. And he has a good response to that request. He says, no, God's going to reign over you. I'm not going to be your king. My sons aren't going to be your kings. God will be your king. But then notice what Gideon does after that. So he asked them, he says, I want each of you to give me some of the spoil that you took from Midian, some of the gold. And he gathers up really a huge amount of gold. It's like 1,700 shekels of gold there in verse 26. And he takes that gold and he makes an ephod and he sets it up in his city of Ophrah. And it says there in verse 27, it became a snare to get into his house, and all Israel played the harlot with it there. So the people end up worshiping this ephod. This maybe it's a monument or memorial that Gideon has set up to remind people of what he had done. And then after that, it says in verse 30, Gideon had 70 sons who were offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. So despite Gideon saying, I'm not going to be your king, which was the right answer, he kind of starts to act like a king, right? He takes many wives. He essentially taxes the people to set up a monument to his accomplishment, what he had done for the people there. So even though he says, I'm not going to be your king, in some ways, he acts like he is a king. And he also makes some pretty poor decisions here. I want to notice a little detail here about his son Abimelech specifically. It says he had a lot of wives, and he also had a concubine in Shechem who bore him a son named Abimelech. Did Gideon live in Shechem? We're told just a couple verses before, his city was Ophrah. Now, best I can tell, we don't know exactly where Ophrah was. We do know where Shechem was. We'll get into that in a little bit. But best guess is it's probably about 10 to 15 miles between Ophrah and Shechem. So Gideon chooses to take a concubine who lives in a different city and has a son with her that presumably he's not around much. It's likely he would have gone to Shechem at times, but he wasn't living there. He certainly did not make a great choice in taking. You make the argument in the Bible that anytime somebody takes a lot of wives, it always causes problems for them, right? You think about Abraham, you think about Solomon, you think about David, and how many problems they have because they pursued multiple wives. We're going to see how this decision affects Gideon's family later on. But then another good thing with Gideon, he does keep the people faithful to God. We're told in verse 32 that when he dies, it says, So it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who delivered them from the hands of their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal in accordance with the good that he had done for Israel. The way that verse reads, it almost sounds like the second he died, they were just waiting to get back to worshiping Baal like they wanted to. Gideon was able to keep the people at least somewhat faithful to God and remembering what God had done for them. But as soon as he's gone, that's over. And that then is going to lead into a conspiracy by his son Abimelech. Let's look at what happens here. So Abimelech, remember, he's from a different city than the rest of his family. He's from Shechem. The rest of his family is in Ophrah. So he goes to his mother's brothers, his mother's family, and he says, what's better? Is it better for all of Gideon's sons to rule over you? Or is it better that I rule over you? I am your own flesh and blood. I belong to this city with you. Would you rather have Gideon's sons or would you rather have me? And he's able to convince them that they want to follow him. Now, note that there's no indication here that Gideon's sons were even attempting to rule. Maybe they were, but there's no indication here that that's the case. Certainly, Gideon had already told the people that his sons would not rule over them. But that doesn't stop Abimelech from using that to try to gain influence over the city of Shechem. So they listen to him. They agree to follow him. They actually go and they take some money from the temple of Baal-berith there in the city, and they give him that money, and with that money, he hires some people, some mercenaries, to help him in what he's about to do. And the Bible describes them as worthless and reckless men. These are just not good people. You know, that probably describes Abimelech pretty well, too, as we'll see as we go through this morning. But they're worthless, reckless men. They're just there to cause trouble. So he takes his men, he travels to Ophrah, to his father's house. He arrests all his brothers and kills them all, except for one, which we'll see in just a minute. You know, I have to think here, if you just kind of look at some of the details that we're given here, it could be that Abimelech just wanted the power. He just wanted his brothers out of the way so that he could pursue the kingdom that he was after. And yet, I think there's some detail here that maybe suggests there's something more going on. Remember what I said a few minutes ago about how every time in the Bible somebody takes multiple wives, it causes problems for them? we can presume that Gideon did not spend a lot of time around his son Abimelech. His other sons, who were more legitimate because they were sons of his wives and not sons of a concubine, they would have gotten more of his time. They would have been more recognized as his heirs as far as inheritance and as far as status goes as a son. In fact, if we skip down a little bit to what the one son that survives, Jotham, he says something down in verse 18. He calls Abimelech the son of my father's female servant. So even he kind of takes a dig at Abimelech's status as a son here. And it seems like maybe there's it's kind of personal for Abimelech here. It's not just that he wants his brothers out of the way. He has a personal vendetta against them. Why do I say that? It specifies that he kills them all on one stone, which means it's not like he just sent his men and said, hey, go kill all those guys. He takes the time to execute all of them one by one. This is speculation, of course, but it does feel like there's something personal about what he does here. And then after that, all the men of Shechem, they gather together, and he is crowned king there in Shechem. It says, beside the terebinth tree at the pillar that was in Shechem. So Abimelech is crowned as the king. So we want to look a little bit at Shechem, and I want to go into some detail about the history of this city. So if you look at the map here, Shechem is located, and I thought I had a red circle on there, but it's located in Ephraim, just on the north side of Ephraim, where that little wave is in the border there between Ephraim and Manasseh. Shechem is a city that we learn about a lot in the Bible. It's actually comes up quite a bit in the Old Testament. First of all, in Genesis chapter 12, when Abraham is traveling, or I guess it's Abram at the time, when Abram is traveling into the Promised Land for the first time, this is the first place that he stops. And this is where God comes to Abram and says, this is the land that I'm going to give you. Now, keep in mind, when Abram's traveling, there wasn't like a defined border, a sign. How on the interstate when you go into a different state, there's welcome to Tennessee sign. There was no welcome to Canaan sign when he started into the land. So he may have had some inclination to believe that this was the land, but it's not until he gets to Shechem that God appears to him and says, this is it. This is where I'm going to give you land and an inheritance. And so Abram builds an altar there to God, there in Shechem. Jacob then buys a plot of land probably about 200 years after Abram built that altar. Jacob has come back from being in the east with Laban. He's come back. He's settling back down in the land, and he buys a plot of land there near the city of Shechem. At this time, Shechem has been established as a city. A man named Hamor had established the city, and Jacob buys some land from him to dwell in. This land becomes important. This land is recognized for the rest of the Old Testament as part of the inheritance of the children of Israel. Jacob ends up being buried there. Even though he's down in Egypt for the end of his life, Joseph and his brothers bring Jacob back up to this plot of land and bury him there. And it's recognized because he actually bought it from the inhabitants of the land. Even before they inherited the whole land, that portion is recognized as Israel's land. Not too long, presumably after he buys that plot of land, his sons overthrow that city to avenge their sister Dinah. If you remember, Hamor's son, who was named Shechem, he had raped Dinah, their sister, and then wanted to marry her. And of course, Jacob's sons kind of pull a little deception on the people of Shechem and end up overthrowing the city, killing all the men of the city, and destroy it. At that time, Jacob feels like he's forced to leave. He tells his sons, you've made me a stench to the inhabitants of the land. So he ends up relocating after this incident away from this plot of land that he had bought there. Archaeology tells us that during the time that the children of Israel were in Egypt, this became a very important Canaanite city. There was a huge fortress temple that was built there probably around the 17th century BC. So that's probably 200 to 300 years before this incident that we're reading about this morning. I'll give you some more details on that in just a minute. Here is the modern site that is believed to be this temple that we're reading about here. You can see the fortified wall down here on this side, and then a couple other structures. There's also an altar that's been unearthed there, as well as a stone pillar that's been set up that may or may not be the pillar that's referred to in verse 6 that we just read, where Abimelech was crowned king. Some more details. This is the location of Joshua's farewell address. Remember in Joshua 24, the famous speech where he says, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." This is where that happened. He gathered all Israel to Shechem for that address. And he sets up a stone at the end of that speech as he commemorates an agreement, a covenant between him and the people that they would continue to follow God even after he was gone. That may be the stone that's referred to there in verse 6 that has been found at the site. Obviously, we don't know, but it certainly would fit. As they were settling the land, Shechem was designated as a city of refuge. If you remember, that's one of those cities that people could go to escape vengeance after an accidental death. It was also a city that was dedicated to the Levites. So interesting dual purpose for this city that was assigned to it when they settled the land and divided it up between all the people. It's also located right between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. If you remember what happened on Ebal and Mount Gerizim, when the people first come into the land, they go there and they pronounce the blessings and the curses to each other. So some of the tribes go up on one mountain, some go up on the other, and they recite parts of the law and what will happen if they do and don't follow the law. My understanding is that you can go to these locations today, go up on those mountains, and there is something unique about the acoustics there where if you're up on the mountain, you can speak loud enough that someone all the way down in the valley could hear you. It's kind of interesting fact that it backs up the biblical account of these cities. So Shechem, what I'm trying to get you to see here is Shechem is a really important city. And it's so important, in fact, that it's functioning as kind of a makeshift capital for the city, for the nation of Israel at this time. Now, we often want to think of Israel as a nation at this time like us. Really, in the time of the judges, they're a little more segmented. They're a little more broken up. Remember, they don't have any fast ways of communicating, right? So somebody in the far north wouldn't be able to communicate easily with somebody in the south. It's a large area. They were more a group of tribes that kind of cooperated, but weren't a full nation. But if there is a capital of the nation of Israel, it's probably the city of Shechem. Up until very recently, when I read this story, I thought Abimelech was the king of Shechem. But if you read verse 22 of Judges 9, it says, after Abimelech had reigned over Israel 3 years. Abimelech is the king not just of Shechem. He's the king of Israel at this point. He has made himself the king by getting the cooperation of the men of the most important city of the 12 tribes at this time. So he's become the king there, and he's reigned for 3 years. Now, I want to look at, before we get back to that, I want to look at what Jotham has to say about that. Jotham is the one son that escaped. Jotham somehow escaped his brother, and he goes up on Mount Gerizim. Remember how we just said that you can go up on Mount Gerizim and people can hear you down below? Jotham actually goes up on the mountain and has some things to say. He tells a parable, and it's a very, very pointed parable. You remember how when Jesus was telling parables, his disciples sometimes criticized him, and they said, people don't understand what you're trying to say with these parables. Okay? Jotham doesn't have that problem. Jotham is very, very direct in what he says in this parable that he tells. And that's what we just read before I got up here, where he says, basically describes a scenario where the trees want a king. And the trees go to several of these good trees and say, we want you to reign over us. And the analogy here is probably the idea that Israel had gone to Jotham's father, Gideon, and asked him to be king, and he had declined. But in the parable, all these trees decline because they have better things to do. They have more important tasks. The olive tree, the fig tree, the grapevine, they have more important things to do than be the king over the trees. But then they come to the bramble or the briar bush, and they ask the bramble to rule over them as king. And so the bramble says in verse 18, "If in truth you anoint me as king over you, then come and take shelter in my shade, and if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon." So, of course, the bramble here, in his analogy, is his brother Abimelech. I do think it's funny that the bramble says, "If you want me to be your king, come take shelter in my shade." If you ever try to take shelter or find shade under a bramble, under a briar bush, not a great place to take shelter. But notice also that his acceptance of the kingdom is very conditional. If you really want me to be your king, then yeah, I'll be your king. But if not, I will destroy you. And then he goes on and he curses Abimelech and Shechem. He has things to say very direct to them. I'll just read that starting in verse 16. "Now therefore, if you have acted in truth and sincerity in making Abimelech king, and if you have dealt well with Jerubbaal and his house, and have done to him as he deserves, for my father fought for you, risked his life, and delivered you out of the hand of Midian, but you have risen up against my father's house this day, and killed his 70 sons on one stone, and made Abimelech, the son of his female servant, king over the men of Shechem, because he is your brother. If then you have acted in truth and sincerity with Jerubbaal and his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come from Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem and Beth Millo. Let fire come from the men of Shechem and from Beth Millo and devour Abimelech." And Jotham ran away and fled, and he went to Beer and dwelt there for fear of Abimelech his brother. So Jotham pronounces a curse. He says, "Let fire come from Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem." Remember, that's going to be important a little later. After he says these things, he runs away and goes to another city to live because he's afraid of Abimelech, his brother. Just one note there, the fact that he says what he has to say and immediately runs away kind of backs up the fact that he went up on Mount Gerizim and the people could hear what he was saying. The people down in the city in Shechem were able to hear the curses that he had pronounced on them, and that's why he needed to get away quickly. All right, so then back to verse 22, where we said, Abimelech's been the king over Israel for 3 years. We don't have any details about this time period. Not much has happened, apparently. But a 3-year period passes where Abimelech is reigning as the king. But then, things start to go south. It says in verse 23 that God sent a spirit of ill will between Abimelech and the men of Shechem, and the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. So they get disgruntled. They're not happy with Abimelech anymore. We're not told really why, other than that God had caused this to happen. So they decide, well, we're going to start causing some trouble. So Abimelech is not in the city of Shechem at this time. He's somewhere else. We're not told exactly where. He's got someone who is kind of the ruler of the city, that's kind of his lieutenant, named Zebul. But the men of Shechem, they're in the mountains of Ephraim, and they start setting up some ambushes around the city, up on the mountains, just in the desolate areas, and people who were traveling through would get waylaid and robbed, and just generally bad stuff going on. If you're a king over a nation, is this the kind of thing that you want going on in your nation? No, you don't want this kind of unrest, this insecurity. You want things to be smooth so that people don't get upset with you. But the people of Shechem are just creating some problems for Abimelech. He's told about it. He doesn't do anything initially. Then a guy named Gaul comes around. Gaul moves to the city of Shechem, and he starts kind of talking. He starts saying, who is this Abimelech guy anyways? Why should he be our king? If only I was in charge of Shechem. If these people were under my authority, then we could get rid of Abimelech and get him out of here. Eventually, he talks and gets enough people on his side, and they start to ally with him, and he finally challenges Abimelech. He tells him in verse 29, increase your army and come out. So Zebul, remember, he's the ruler of the city. He's Abimelech's lieutenant of sorts. He hears all this, and he's upset about it. So he sends to Abimelech secretly and says, hey, you need to do something about this. He gives them some counsel as to what he should do and how he should attack. And we won't go into all the detail. There's actually a lot of detail here in the next few verses. But the end result is that Abimelech destroys the city of Shechem. It's completely destroyed. Not just he attacks them, defeats them, and then leaves and lets them be. He destroys the buildings in the city, levels it, says he sowed it with salt, which would prevent them from being able to farm there. So it just becomes an uninhabitable city for probably 100 years once it's been sowed with salt. Just completely removes it off the face of the earth. So remember what we said a few minutes ago, what Jotham cursed the city with. When he said, let fire come from Abimelech and destroy the city. Look what happens next. There's a tower there in Shechem. Remember we talked about that, how it's been found today. That tower was both a temple and a fortress. It was the temple of Baal-berith. When the people had conquered the land, they had left that structure and apparently used it for other purposes. But as soon as Gideon was dead, this became the temple of Baal-berith again. It also provided a safe fortress for the people. And so people in Shechem who weren't killed in the initial attack, they retreat into the tower of Shechem to hide from Abimelech. So he goes into the forest nearby. He cuts a branch and tells all the people with him, do exactly what you've seen me do. Throws a branch over his shoulder, carries it to Shechem, sets it up against the tower. They light it on fire and burn the entire tower to the ground. So, literally, Jotham's curse is fulfilled. I'm not suggesting that Jotham was prophesying when he made his curse, but it seems that God worked things such that Jotham's curse was literally fulfilled in Shechem. The people of Shechem are killed by the fire of Abimelech. Well, next, fresh off this victory, Abimelech's going to go attack the city of Thebez. Evidently, this city was also part of the rebellion against him, and they also had a strong tower. And Abimelech says, well, my strategy last time worked, we're going to do that again. He attempts to burn that tower down just like he had in Shechem, but a woman drops an upper millstone, a big, large stone from the top of the tower. It hits him in the head. It says it crushed his skull. He's not dead, but he knows he's going to die, and so he tells his armor bearer, quickly, kill me so that nobody ever says a woman killed him. So now 3,000 years later on a Sunday morning, we're sitting here talking about how a woman killed him. If you ever think that God doesn't have a sense of humor, just look at this verse and how God made sure that it was recorded what happened to Abimelech and how badly he wanted it not to be said of him that a woman killed him. God made sure we knew that for the rest of time, that a woman killed Abimelech. It says in verse 55, when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, they departed every man to his place. So they all disperse. It's all over with. Everybody just kind of disperses. And so it's summarized, this whole episode is summarized in verse 56 and 57. It says, thus God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech, which he had done to his father by killing his 70 brothers. And all the evil of the men of Shechem, God returned on their own heads, and on them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal. Is this a fun story to read? Most of Judges is kind of like this, isn't it? My 8-year-old saying, yes, it's a very fun story. Well, in the context of thinking about God's chosen people, is this where we expect God's people to be? Is this what we expect them to be doing? No. The book of Judges is full of stories like this, where nobody's a hero, where everybody looks bad. It's just not a pleasant story to consider. As I was preparing to teach this class a couple weeks ago, I knew I wanted to talk about Abimelech. But as I got through it, sometimes when you go find these more obscure stories, it can be hard to really draw anything out of. Yeah, it's interesting to know the facts of what happened, but what can we take away from this? Some things that maybe jump out to me that we could take away from this story. One is that evil choices have consequences even if they are delayed. How long was it from when Abimelech committed this atrocity against his brothers until judgment is rendered? It's 3 whole years. He reigns for 3 years while his brother Jotham has to be in hiding, while the men of Shechem seemingly have done well. Their status is elevated because now the king of Israel is allied with them. Certainly nothing bad seems to have happened to Abimelech during this time. And yet, God's judgment was still coming. It can be easy for us to think, when we're thinking about it personally, like, I've made a bad choice, and I know it. And I think, it's been a while, nothing bad's happened. I might be good. Know that God's judgment is still coming. And just because it's been a long time, just because you haven't heard anything about it in a long time, you think nobody knows, God does. And God will not let it go. On the flip side of that, when we see people around us making evil choices and we don't see those consequences come immediately, what are we tempted to think? God's not fair. God's not just. If God was just at all, he would take care of this right now. That's what we think. But just because we've not seen those consequences, 1, doesn't mean they haven't come. And 2, it certainly doesn't mean that those consequences are not coming. It's very clear in this story that God is orchestrating the events that lead to the city of Shechem being destroyed for their evil and Abimelech being defeated and killed for his evil. Secondly, unwise decisions may have far-reaching consequences. When Abimelech thought, I think I need a concubine in Shechem. When Gideon thought, I need a concubine in Shechem. Do you think he knew what was going to happen to all of his sons because of that decision? Was his decision wrong under the old law? Not that I can tell. Was it a wise decision in alignment with God's intention for marriage and bearing children? No, it was not. And so because of his choice, he has this son who holds a lot of resentment and isn't connected with his brothers and ends up killing all of them because of that. We are sometimes tempted to think, well, this is not sinful, so it's okay. And I would urge you to rethink that way of thinking. That just because I can't look at the Bible and say, look, this says here, I cannot do this. We have to view things from a lens of God's wisdom. And know that just because it doesn't say I can't, doesn't mean I should. We have to make decisions based on God's wisdom and what we, as best we can, to do the right thing, even when it's not necessarily a matter of sin or not sin. Thirdly, I'll say too that capability and charisma don't necessarily make someone a good leader. Clearly, Abimelech had some leadership qualities. He was able to convince the men of Shechem to follow him. And in turn, the rest of Israel. He convinces these people to ally with him and kill his brothers and become their king just basically by talking to them. Clearly, he's got some skills. He's able to talk. He's seemingly pretty charismatic as a leader, and he gets people to follow him. But does that make him a good leader? No. Something we should consider when we think about leaders both within the church and within our society That just because somebody can talk well, can convince people well, that they're charismatic, they appeal to what I want, does not mean that that person is a good leader. And that's something to consider when we're choosing who to follow. Let's go back to Shechem. Consider what happened at Shechem. The land promise first begins to be fulfilled at Shechem. God had told Abraham, I'm going to give you this land. And this is the location where God says, this is it. This is what I'm going to give you. And then a few hundred years later, where they first get the children of Israel get their own land there in Shechem, when Jacob buys a portion of that property. This is also where Israel is reminded of the covenant that they have with God when they receive the land. They claim the land, the thing he's promised them. He says, remember the covenant that I have with you. Remember what I say is going to happen if you will follow me, and what will happen if you don't. When the promise is fulfilled, God calls them to Shechem to remind them of what he's done for them. But here in this story that we've read this morning, Israel rejects God as their king and as their God. They ask Gideon to be their king, and Gideon says no. They ask Abimelech to be their king, and he says yes. Remember what God said to Samuel later on when they asked for a king and he goes to anoint Saul. God tells Samuel, they've not rejected you, they've rejected me. So here, they've rejected God as their king. They've also rejected God as their God. The second that Gideon was dead, what did they do? They went back into that temple that had been sitting there, and they said, this is the temple of Baal. And this is where we worship our God, Baal. Turn over to John chapter 4. In John chapter 4, Jesus is traveling from Judea back to Galilee, but he has to go through Samaria. And it says in verse 5, he came to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, therefore, being weary from his journey, sat thus by the well. What plot of ground is being discussed here? Where are we in this story? We're right here in the same spot. Right here near the city of Shechem, near the plot of ground that Jacob had bought from Shechem. And then you know the rest of the story. A woman comes and talks with Jesus and is blown away by the things that he says to her. And finally that culminates in verse 25 with her saying to him, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. And so on the same piece of ground where God had begun to fulfill the land promise, the same plot of ground where the nation that God had promised claimed that land, and the same plot of ground that those people had rejected God as their God and as their king, the seed promise is fulfilled when Jesus says, I who speak to you am he. I am the Messiah. I am he who is coming. And thus God's promises to Abraham were fulfilled. Isn't it interesting that I started out wanting to talk to you about Abimelech, and now we end up talking about Jesus? Isn't it funny how that works sometimes? Something always to be looking for when we are faced with these stories in the Old Testament that are just hard to wrestle with. Hard to understand how God could even let some of these things happen. And yet all through those things we see what God is working for his people. We see that God is faithful to his promises even despite the rejection that he gets from those same people. here in this same piece of ground. I hope this is interesting to you. I hope this is maybe more in depth than you thought about this story before. And I hope you can see how, as crazy as the story is, how it still connects us to the overall story of the Bible. That the one who was coming came. That God kept his promise, just like he keeps his promises to us. The study this morning is, of course, for those of us who are Christians to learn something. And I hope you did learn something. I hope it helped you to consider these things this morning. But I also want to speak to anybody who is not a Christian this morning. I want you to know that just like all the rest of us, you have rejected God as your God and as your King. All of us have. And yet God is still faithful. God still stands ready to accept you back. He wants you to be with him. He wants to be your God. And we want that for you too. And I encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity you have this morning to take the first step in that. To choose to follow. To choose to make God your God and your King. If there's anything we can do for you this morning, you have an opportunity, and please come as we stand and sing.